Hi there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat on ABC News and News Radio. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week we will take you into the room where it happened. One for the Hamilton fans, our guest, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who says his old boss does not deserve a second term and is simply unfit for office.
News on the debate schedule, the coronavirus pandemic, a new George Floyd video, and lots of polls.
But first, we are just a week and a half away from the Democratic convention where Joe Biden will become their nominee for president, but it will be a convention like none we've ever seen before. No delegates in straw boaters and noisemakers, no balloon drops and confetti, no marching bands. The nominee won't even be there in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Joe Biden will make his acceptance speech from Delaware. Meanwhile, after first shifting most of the Republican convention from North Carolina to Florida, then cancelling the Florida component, President Trump has now floated the idea of giving his acceptance speech outside the White House. Now, that is a huge break with protocol and precedent. Typically, presidents limit campaigning to outside of the official residence, not taking campaign and fundraising meetings or even phone calls from the Oval Office. Some suggest this would be a big breach of the Hatch Act, which governs political activity on federal property, but President Trump, for one, disagrees.
It is legal. There is no Hatch Act because it doesn't pertain to the president. But if I use the White House, we save tremendous amounts of money for the government in terms of security, traveling. If we go to another state or some other location, the amount of money is, very enormous. So that's something to consider also. I think it would be a very convenient location. It would be by far the least expensive location. There'd be very little in terms of that tremendous traveling security with airplanes and everybody flying all over the place. So I think it would be a very convenient idea. It's something that we threw out. It would be very cost conscious by comparison to any other location.
It's really so nice that he's worried about money at this stage, Chaz, except that, of course, his campaign should be paying for it anyway. And this is the guy, of course, who wanted to hold the G7 at his struggling Doral golf resort. What do you think of this?
That is true. Well, first of all, I do agree with Trump that this is not a Hatch Act violation because he's right. It doesn't pertain to the president. Having said that, he has staff working on this and it might pertain to them. Mm-hmm. Having said that, this is not something that bothers me much. I mean, if we're worried about the norm about presidents campaigning from the White House, that went 6 months ago.
Yeah,
that's gone.
And some would argue as well that this is no different from every incumbent president seeking re-election going to campaign events in Air Force One.
Totally.
I mean,
totally.
they use the trappings of the office.
Yeah.
So there has been this sort of almost church and state separation up until now, and a lot of people in Washington and on both sides are getting a little bit anxious about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in particular, while I'm not worried about it, some Republicans are. Number 2 Senate Republican John Thune said, "Is that even legal? I think anything you do on federal property would seem to be problematic." And Trump's spokesman for his inaugural committee, Alex Stroman, wrote, "Mark me down as being opposed to delivering the acceptance speech from the White House. It becomes just another speech from the White House and sets a bad precedent." I do agree with that, that it's actually probably not valuable because he has given so many speeches from the White House. It seems just kind of ordinary. I feel like the president should be able to find a more majestic location, maybe anywhere in America. By the way, that goes for Joe Biden as well. He's talking about delivering it from the basement.
I'm not sure if he's going to deliver it from the base. He's talking about doing it from Delaware, his home state, maybe from Wilmington. Look, whether he's going to do it from the front porch, and, up until the 1860s, there were plenty of literally front porch campaigns for president that were run. So, look, he could be looking at something small scale like that. He's still making the point that it's not safe to be having large crowds, large gatherings.
Absolutely, and he's right, but that doesn't mean he can't deliver it in an amphitheatre that doesn't have a crowd with a big screen behind them or something, or somewhere. Okay, if it's in the Wilmington Town Square or something, sure, but just, God, get out of the basement. It's becoming a thing, I think.
Yeah. Look, and clearly this is going to have, as far as conventions go, it'll be a lot more tightly controlled. There'll be a lot more pre-recorded segments to it. The Biden campaign people that are working on this, they appreciate the fact that they're getting a couple of hours of free airtime on major TV networks for 3-4 nights in a row. So this is still going to have a lot of interest in it. But you're right. I mean, if this does look like a really dodgy kind of, poor quality broadband and Joe Biden at his house and all that kind of thing, I mean, you would hope that the ad makers, the image makers are going to turn this into something of an attribute so that you don't get the kind of chaos that they got. Because remember, 4 years ago, it was scenes at the Democratic Convention where there were a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who were particularly unhappy once those emails were leaked that basically showed that Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the DNC had their finger on the scales for Hillary Clinton all along. That was enough to, and obviously that was sort of outside interference, but it was enough to stir up passions. These conventions are usually well stage managed, but they can get out of hand, and there's still the potential, whenever you have a disaffected progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that things could have gotten a little bit ugly because they've got platform issues to nut out and all sorts of things. So
just mute them on Zoom. No problem. Problem over.
Right, exactly. So it is going to be fascinating to see whether this has an impact. But as for President Trump, politicking from the Oval Office, I think you're right, whether it's the Rose Garden or the press briefing room. Every time Donald Trump speaks, he doesn't speak as the President of the United States, he speaks as a candidate for re-election. He filed his paperwork for re-election a week after he became President in 2017. He has never stopped being a candidate. He's always been more comfortable as a candidate than he has, frankly, as a President. He welcomes the political cut and thrust. Presidential leadership is a bit more foreign to him.
Yeah. Thanks, Al.
All right. President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, he's written to the Debate Commission asking for a fourth debate to be scheduled. The first debate is due to be held on the 29th of September in Cleveland, Ohio, with 2 more debates to be held later in October. There's also a one-off vice presidential debate slated for October the 7th. Now, President Trump not only wants an extra debate, he says the first debate needs to be much sooner than that.
How can voters be sending in ballots starting in some cases 1 month before the first presidential debate? Move the first debate up. A debate to me is a public service. Joe Biden and I owe it to the American people.
But earlier today, the Commission on Presidential Debates said basically no. The schedule is set. They will not be moving the schedule around and they will not be bringing in a fourth debate. But it does raise the question of why does Donald Trump want a fourth debate anyway?
Well, he thinks that he's a much better debater than Joe Biden, and Joe Biden should be rain scared. He seems to have forgotten that Joe Biden just got through, 10 debates against people like Elizabeth Warren, who was a very good debater. And hey, Joe Biden didn't shine on stage, but he still won the nomination.
Yeah, he was solid, if not extraordinary, and he was, I think, fair to say, he was better as the debates got smaller. He was self-censoring through those early debates when he was one of 12, when they had the 2 debate stages going with a dozen candidates on each. Biden was there kind of cutting himself off mid-sentence and saying, oh, I've gone on too long and all that. He's moderating himself because he knows that he's a bit of an old blowhard. Yeah. But by the time he got to that one-on-one debate with Bernie Sanders, that final COVID debate, it was awkward. There was no crowd. And everyone was sort of, finding this all a little bit foreign. But that's going to be what the Trump debate is going to be like in terms of the dynamics. No crowd, keeping your distance, so there's no sort of lurking over Hillary's shoulder as Trump did in 2016. So I suspect that that is more the template that Biden is going to be following from. And he wasn't extraordinary, but there was nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I continue to think that Trump is making a serious mistake by pushing so hard that Biden will fall apart during the debate because he's setting the bar below ground level. And if Biden doesn't trip over his shoelaces walking on, he's going to look like a winner because they've said the expectations are so low.
It's always, usually you have 2 candidates that are pumping each other up because that way a pass grade is suddenly a win if you don't end up, in the case of Joe Biden, having a major senior moment. Now, I guess the only possibility is if Joe Biden were to blank, or if there even was something that, even if you're watching the debate live, may have just been a momentary hesitation. But once it gets edited together with every other pause or quizzical expression from Biden, you know that on social media there'll be a mashup of Joe Biden's senior moments, whether you noticed it at the time anyway. That's going to... But the reality is going to be...
There's so many of them out there already anyway.
Well, that's true. So, and we've got to remember, Joe Biden, 36 years a senator, 3 presidential campaigns, 8 years as vice president with 2 vice presidential debates, whether it was against, Paul Ryan or Sarah Palin or all of the Senate debates, he is used to standing on his feet and talking, and talking and talking and talking. It's a senator's skill.
Yeah, he's a different guy to what he used to be, though. To be fair, I was watching the Paul Ryan debate a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
And he's a different guy to what he was in 2012.
Well,
real different guy.
Show me a 77-year-old who is not different to what they were in their 60s or their 50s or their 40s. But still, Joe Biden, having lost a step, and I think we can all agree on that, and not buying into the dementia stuff as well, which there's absolutely no evidence for. But I think all of us can say in our own lives, there are significant changes that happen to people in their 70s, and they no longer seem like this perennially middle-aged candidate. They suddenly seem like an old person.
But leaving aside the fourth debate for a second, the proposed fourth debate, I have to say that I think it's a huge shame that they're not getting an earlier debate, like moving the third debate earlier, which is another thing that they proposed, because I think their logic for an early debate was actually very strong. Rudy Giuliani explained it to the Debates Commission originally, writing, by the time of the first presidential debate on September 29, as many as 8 million Americans in 16 states will have already started voting. That's a great argument. Of course they should have the debates early with all the mail-in voting going on. Having people voting for their candidate before they've even seen the debate, I think is insane. And so why not move it earlier? To be honest, I think it actually helps both candidates, because Trump's looking to get back in the race. He's hoping for a major gaffe from Biden or him to put in a good performance. Sure, that makes sense. From Biden's perspective, they're desperate to get people doing mail-in voting. At the moment, people feel like the election is years away, but as soon as the first debate comes, they think, it's just around the corner. They'll get mail-in voting. So I think it actually helps both candidates for there to be an early debate. So I wish they had worked that out.
It is. I think there are probably two things in Trump's mind. One is he is hoping for, a miracle cure to the problem of Joe Biden now, which is Joe Biden implodes on the debate stage, and that is unlikely. The other thing that, if he's smart, he should know that historically incumbent presidents always have a lousy first debate. We saw it with Obama, we saw it with Reagan, we saw it with Bill Clinton. Joe Biden has had 10 or 11 debates in the last year. Donald Trump has not had a debate since October 2016. Not only that, but he's been surrounded by people saying, yes, Mr. President, whatever you say, Mr. President, 3 bags full, Mr. President. And having moderators confronting him and a rival candidate criticising him to his face. That's the kind of thing that can make presidents, when they're not used to being criticised to their face, maybe from reporters, but if Joe Biden is telling Donald Trump that he's an abject failure, that's going to push some buttons. We saw Barack Obama get very testy in that first debate in 2012 against Mitt Romney. He really didn't like it. He looked surly and he lost the debate. So Trump may be wanting to get this first debate just out of the way, or the people around him like Rudy Giuliani, who's possibly, a wiser head when it comes to the realities of politics. He's been in a lot of presidential debates himself, candidate debates himself from his campaigns.
Well, we saw exactly how Trump is when he gets confronted on his feet during that Axios interview this week with Jonathan Swan. I think I've got an excerpt ready. Can we play that one?
Right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the world?
Lower than
what does that
Europe.
mean? In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad. Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
You can't do that. You have
Why
to go.
can't I do that?
You have to go by. You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases. The cases.
Why
are
not
dead.
as a proportion of
when
population?
We have somebody. What it says is when you have somebody that has where there's a case.
Oh, okay.
The people that live from those cases.
It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population versus South Korea.
No, because you have to go by the cases.
Well, look at South Korea, for example. 51 million population, 300 deaths. It's crazy
you
compared
don't
to
know that.
I do. It's
you don't know that.
You think they're faking their statistics? South Korea?
I won't get into that because I have a very good relationship with the country. But you don't know that.
Yeah, Trump didn't do too well there, but he's up against Biden, who's also not exactly a master. You might recall about a month ago, he was asked about whether he'd taken a cognitive test because Trump was going on about it, and he said this.
Have you been tested for some degree of cognitive decline?
I've been tested and I'm constantly tested.
Okay. So that was his answer, and that was a very vague answer. So unsurprisingly, he was asked about it again just now. I say unsurprisingly, everyone might have expected that question, except for apparently Joe Biden.
When asked in June if you'd been tested for cognitive decline, you've responded that you're constantly tested in effect because you're in situations like this on the campaign trail. But please clarify specifically, have you taken a cognitive test?
No, I haven't taken a test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying before you got in this program, if you take a test where you're taking cocaine or not, what do you think, huh? Are you a junkie?
What do you say to President Trump, who brags about his test and makes your mental state an issue for voters?
Well, if he can't figure out the difference between an elephant and a lion, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Did you watch that? Look, come on, man. I know you're trying to goad me, but I mean, I'm so forward looking to have an opportunity to sit with the president or stand with the president in debates. There can be plenty of time. And by the way, as I joke with him, I shouldn't say it. I'm going to say something I probably shouldn't say. Anyway, I am very willing to let the American public judge my physical and mental my physical as well as my mental fitness, and to make a judgment about who I am.
Now, I played that whole answer. Forget the stutter at the end. Like, he's got a stutter, that's fine. Forget that. I played that whole answer because he had, 4 false starts for a question that he should have been expecting. He should have had a memorised answer ready.
Yep.
He is very bad. It has to be said. Like, they just, the two of them have to be the least impressive speakers that we have seen together in a presidential contest that I can think of. It's just appalling. How have we got to this point? It's so bad.
Well, so I guess the answer to that is that the debates aren't necessarily the be-all and end-all of any candidacy, whether it's in a primary or for the presidency or whatever. And Al Gore out-debated George W. Bush. John Kerry out-debated George W. Bush. It didn't matter. It's not how most people make their choices. In the case of Joe Biden, the cognitive test thing is kind of interesting because if you have no reason to believe that there's any cognitive decline or serious cognitive decline beyond just the gradual cognitive impairments that tend to happen with age, that are vascular dementia, these kinds of things, you wouldn't set about to have one of those tests. Now, the Trump had one of those tests. And it sounds like he might have had one of those tests after one of those unscheduled visits to hospital. Went off to Walter Reed last November, etc. That tells us more than the fact that Biden hasn't had the test. And Biden also knows you're falling into Trump's trap, because this is like saying, well, where's the birth certificate that proves that you're not a Kenyan Muslim? Oh, well, here's the birth certificate. Or where's the long-form birth certificate? How do we know that's not a fake? No amount of evidence is going to prove otherwise. If Biden takes the test, and it says, no signs of any problem, well, they're going to say, who did this test? Do the test again. How long ago was the test taken? Wasn't a very tough test, etc. So it's a no-win situation.
I do agree that it's a trap. I still reckon that those two make George W. Bush look like Cicero. But I'll talk more about debates in the podcast because we should move on. Let's go on to the next one.
All right then. Now, President Trump's summer of terrible polling may be coming to an end. In the national average of polls this week, he's on footy 2.7%. He hasn't been that high since late May. Joe Biden, for his part, is down 2 points from his peak in June of 51%, but he's still in a pretty solid position. Biden's lead in national polls this week ranged from between 3 up to 10 points. If we just look at the top 6 battleground states, Biden's lead narrows to 4.7 percentage points.
Yeah, and to put those numbers in context, by the way, 538's compared Biden's average margin over Trump this year to Hillary's average margin in 2016. And you can see that we have just passed the point where Hillary hit her absolute peak during a post-convention bounce, and she still didn't have as large a margin as Biden currently enjoys, and then things dropped off for her considerably from there. Also of note, 538 compared Hillary's support percentages to Biden's support percentages, total support, and they're not even close. Biden is between 4 and 8 points higher support than Clinton all year, and that is what I suspect would be making Trump most nervous.
Yeah. Now, a number of viewers have asked recently, particularly online, are these polls after 2016 even worth paying any attention to? And some other viewers as well were surprised that we had our guest on Planet America this week, Robert Cahaley of the Trafalgar Polling Group, who made a pretty bold claim. He says Trump is actually winning now and he's going to win by more in November. Take a look.
It won't be a surprise to us, as it wasn't a surprise 4 years ago when we predicted 306 to 232, which ended up being right. I would tell you if the election were today, he would still win the Electoral College by at least 4%, by 4 votes on the Electoral College. But I think it is probably set to get better.
Now, Robert Cahaley's reputation is built on having been the only pollster to pick Trump's 2016 victory in Michigan. He also tipped the Electoral College, give or take a couple of faithless electors. His secret? Well, he says his firm managed to contact and poll what he refers to as shy Trump voters who felt so stigmatised that they usually avoid talking to pollsters, or pollsters just didn't consider them to be likely voters in 2016 given they hadn't voted in recent elections, or in fact in some cases they'd never voted in their life. Trafalgar's Michigan poll on the eve of the election in 2016 had Trump 2 points ahead. He ended up winning by 0.3. So that is within the poll's margin of error of 2.8%. All other polls in the week before the election in Michigan had Hillary Clinton leading by between 4 and 6 points. Now, in the end, Trump's Michigan margin was under 11,000 votes. Almost 5% of the vote went to third-party candidates. Libertarian Gary Johnson won 172,000 votes in Michigan. The Greens' Jill Stein won more than 51,000. And while it's true Trump did find around 150,000 more Republican voters in Michigan than Mitt Romney had in 2012, the biggest difference was the collapse in Hillary Clinton's vote. Her primary vote was almost 300,000 lower than Barack Obama 4 years earlier. Jill Stein got an extra 30,000 votes from her 2012 result. Trump won with 280,000 fewer votes than Obama had 4 years earlier. So hypothetically, Trump would have been thrashed by Obama. Trafalgar's poll overstated Trump's support by nearly 2 points as well. Now, there is no data for Michigan in particular, but nationally we do know that some Obama voters certainly flipped to Trump, around 13% of them, while just 4% of Romney voters flipped to Clinton. So basically Republicans stayed more loyal even if they weren't crazy about Trump. Similar numbers of Trump and Clinton voters said they had not voted in 2012, 20 and 19% respectively, although that includes people who refused to answer. So maybe they fit into that shy category, or they also said in some cases they don't remember who they voted for, which is a bit of a worry. The key to all this, though, is where did that third-party vote come from? Well, 35% said they had voted for Obama, 29% had voted for Romney. So I would suggest that while there are undoubtedly some Trump supporters who don't trust pollsters and the media organisations that publish the polls, they probably aren't as significant as Trafalgar's thesis contends. It is true that polls in Wisconsin in 2016, expressed as a percentage, showed Hillary more than 6 points ahead, and they got her vote share about right, while Trump exceeded his polls by almost 7 points. Evidence, perhaps, of shy voters. The share of the vote, though, going to third-party candidates fell from 12% in the polls to 6% on election day. Republicans came home. But here's the thing. Trump did not win Wisconsin by finding an army of shy supporters. He defeated Hillary Clinton with fewer votes than Mitt Romney got in 2012 when Romney lost by a mile to Obama. The difference, again, the collapse in Clinton's vote, down 230,000, and the surge in support for Johnson, who increased his vote by 86,000, and Stein, who attracted more than 20,000 additional votes. So, bottom line of all of that is I have doubts about this whole notion of the shy Trump voter. Nationally, even if Trafalgar found some in Michigan, the bigger issue in 2016 was disillusioned Obama voters. They didn't turn out and vote for Hillary Clinton. But given their respective histories, I do suspect this year more former Obama voters, particularly the old white male Obama voters, are likely to support Joe Biden rather than turning out for Hillary Clinton. The big question now is, with a lot of Republicans trying to get Kanye West onto the ballot in Wisconsin, he could be the third-party spoiler for Joe Biden there, skimming off particularly African-American male votes. So we're going to find out who's right come November, of course. But just for those who are sort of saying, is that Trafalgar guy for real? Well, there's some scepticism, but ultimately, one poll that matters in 88 days from now.
It's true. All I'd add to that, I think that's good analysis, and there's no doubt that disappointed Democrats lost the election for the Democrats. I think that's true. But all I would say is we don't know if there weren't an equal number or potentially more disappointed Republicans who didn't turn out for Trump, who are balanced by the shy Trump voters. You say, you know, he won slightly less votes than Mitt Romney. Maybe he would have lost a lot more votes than Mitt Romney if this group that Robert Cahaly identified didn't exist, potentially. My point of view on this is that it's too early to call. That we got a sample size of one. He might have just got lucky. And so I want to see what happens.
You can be right for the wrong reason.
Exactly. So I want to see what happens this next election before I draw any conclusions about the shy Trump voters. I don't think it's impossible that it could be true, but I don't think it's been proven yet. So let's see.
Yep, indeed we will.
Should talk COVID.
Yes.
As always, we start with the new cases, and those are continuing to fall, now into the mid 50,000 cases a day range, right next to Brazil and India. Although we should note that testing has fallen by about 15% recently as well. So there could be a connection there. The better news, though, is that the deaths have begun to marginally trail off as well. That 7-day average is now just over 1,000 deaths a day. Now, many have wondered why the deaths haven't risen as high as they did during the first spike in April. And there are a number of potential reasons, like, say, the age of the carriers or the state of the healthcare systems. But here's an interesting one. Just ignore that weird data glitch in June on that graph. The trend is clear. The number of deaths per hospitalisation has been falling over time. It's about a third of the rate it was back in April. That may mean they're getting better at treating these people. They now turn patients onto their tummies, they use ventilators in slightly different ways, and for all the hype about hydroxychloroquine, there is actually a proven medical treatment out there, which is dexamethasone. Trump never mentions that. That has also potentially reduced deaths. So that is good news. But obviously the pandemic isn't over yet. A poll this week from Navigator found that 51% of the American public now personally know someone who has had COVID. And doesn't Joe Biden know it? The main thrust of his advertising these days is all COVID.
I think it's under control. I'll tell you what.
How? 1,000 Americans are dying a day.
They are dying. That's true. And it is what it is. It is what it is. It is what it is. It is what it is.
That's all a bit unsettling. Interestingly, though, Trump isn't responding to that with his own COVID advertising. His advertising is still focused on Biden being a puppet for the left and the silent majority being censored for their opinions.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Now, that ad is catnip to the shy Trump voters that Robert Cahaly reckons are out there. So let's see what happens.
If they are out there. Now to our guest on the Fireside Chat. John Bolton is the former US Ambassador to the United Nations and, of course, National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump. He's author of the new book, The Room Where It Happened. Ambassador Bolton, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Well, glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You've said that Donald Trump is unfit for office, erratic and stunningly uninformed. Should we be concerned that he is still going to be president for at least another 5.5 months, if not another 4.5 years? Or are there enough people around him now to temper those worst excesses?
Well, I think you don't really know until events unfold. I mean, I think the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic has been a failure in large measure attributable to President Trump. He didn't want to hear about the threat from the coronavirus in January and February of this year because he was afraid of the impact on the U.S. economy, which would normally be his ticket to re-election. As is typical with him, he never formed a administration-wide strategy of how to respond. He has not to this day. So really, this is kind of a hallmark of his administration. And I do think that in the 3 months left before the election, that there's a chance for what in American politics we call an October surprise. That is, if the president's still far behind some event, some decision, some show that will try and divert attention or give him an edge in the election on November the 3rd. So I do think it's an uncertain period.
You've also written that he lacks guiding principles and everything is about winning re-election. Given that right now he is trailing Joe Biden quite badly in the average of national polls, are you concerned that he might provoke some kind of international crisis, maybe involving China, in order to try and win re-election?
Well, I think it's likely to be something on the order of a fourth summit with Kim Jong-un that would probably be as substance-free as the first three, but would allow him to declare an end to the war on the Korean Peninsula or the solution to the North Korean nuclear threat, whether those were true or not. I think that you can certainly see in the president's increased rhetoric about China and some steps that have been taken, sanctions, closing the Houston consulate, for example, a tougher line there, which is a reversal of 3+ years of his policy, because he knows that the virus and the fact that it emanated from China and China covered up much of what was going on has contributed to making China very unpopular. The idea that he would ban TikTok, the app, in the United States is an example of playing to the political crowd. But all of that could change after the election, too. So it demonstrates why there really is no philosophical foundation to his policies.
Do you think America is moving in the wrong direction with China at the moment?
No, not at all. I think the fact is we've been asleep while China has engaged in a systematic effort in the economic sphere, politically, militarily, in the intelligence world, to expand its influence in and around its periphery, but really on a worldwide basis. I think that's, for example, what Huawei and ZTE are. They've been weaponized by the Chinese state. They're not telecommunications companies, they're intelligence agencies. And I think the U.S. and much of the rest of the world woke up late to that, certainly not too late, but time's a wasting. And so one should ask not whether Trump's rhetoric, at least today, on China is in the wrong direction, but why he didn't start it three years ago.
Now, you spoke in your book about Trump's erratic nature, but that wouldn't have been a huge surprise going in, would it? Trump's personal shortcomings were already pretty well known at that point in time. So why did you take the job, and was it different to what you expected?
Well, I don't agree that his personality shortcomings were well known. Out on the campaign trail, different candidates act in different ways. You can have all kinds of personal attributes, but certainly I was familiar with all of the criticism that had been leveled against Trump. But typically in the United States, when somebody becomes president, and the gravity of that office, the weight of the responsibility, the consequences of every word, every decision that the president makes, it has an effect on them in the positive direction, that they try and expand their sphere of knowledge. They try and understand the implications of policy decisions in areas that, previously they were not so much familiar with. Nobody comes to the presidency with 360-degree knowledge. Everybody has something to learn. So I thought that the atmospherics notwithstanding, the reality of being president would have an effect on Trump. And my book, The Room Where It Happened, is really an explanation of 17 months of my learning that the gravity of the office didn't have any effect on him at all.
And were there any positive surprises about working under Donald Trump?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as positive, but for all that people talk about his short attention span, and he often does have a short attention span, his focus on his re-election effort shows that when something is potentially personally important to him, his attention span is infinite. The trouble is that apart from his reelection, if he doesn't think it benefits him in some personal political way, it's very hard to get and keep his attention.
During the transition phase, President Obama reportedly warned incoming President Trump that the biggest threat he was going to face was North Korea and its objective of obtaining a nuclear weapon. In your view, how has that been handled, and has the threat from North Korea been diminished at all?
No, I think the threat has increased, and I will say, it was pretty cheeky of Obama to say that to Trump during the transition, since Obama sat there for 8 years and watched North Korea consistently make progress on its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, engaging in what the Obama administration called strategic patience. Nice work, right? That after 8 years, North Korea is closer to that objective of getting nuclear weapons that can deliver on to the United States. I think that it was a fantasy for the President Trump, to think he could negotiate North Korea out of its nuclear weapons program. I don't think the North has ever had any intention to give up its nuclear program voluntarily. There is zero evidence they've made a strategic decision to do that. In fact, all of the evidence is to the contrary. So the negotiations failed, I think, as they were doomed to fail from the outset. But again, now we're 3.5 years into Trump, and North Korea has simply made more progress. It's a slower process than it might have been, but it's drawing inexorably toward the point where North Korea could hit the United States with a nuclear weapon. This is a disaster, a catastrophic failure for American policy over multiple administrations.
Some big international crises, like maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, can play out very publicly. In other cases, we only find out a long time after the event just how dangerous a situation might have become. Was there anything that has happened in your time in the Trump administration that rose to that level of danger that maybe we don't know about?
Well, I think, and I lay some of this out in the book as well, in the struggle with Iran, I think his policy has been inconsistent and erratic, and I think that has led the Iranians into some miscalculations already. Not because we're being too aggressive, because we're not being consistent in applying what we've called the maximum pressure campaign. I think the killing of Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards, was a significant step. But I still don't think there's a coherent policy vis-a-vis Iran, and I think that means there's always a risk of a crisis there developing on very short notice. And the same is true to a somewhat lesser extent, I think, with North Korea.
Now, you've said Trump shouldn't be re-elected, but you've also said you won't vote for Joe Biden. So let's put aside who you'd personally vote for. Would you prefer to see Joe Biden become president than for Trump to be re-elected?
Well, let me put it this way. I think that the damage that Trump has done in one term as president can be corrected. I don't think it would really require extensive effort, both domestic damage and international damage. What he would do in 2 terms, I think, is much more problematic. So for me, the priority is making sure he doesn't get a second term. Now, the reality is that means Biden will probably win. That's the only alternative in our system. That doesn't make me happy either. I mean, I'm going to be unhappy the day after the election, no matter who wins, although for very different reasons. And that's part of the reason I think one of the major tasks for people like myself who consider ourselves, Trump notwithstanding, conservative Republicans, have to take a hand in making sure after November 3rd, whether Trump wins or loses, that the party doesn't nominate somebody like that again in the future.
Finally, John Bolton, I wonder if you were briefing incoming President Joe Biden, or indeed next January briefing a second-term President Donald Trump, what would you be counselling them as the biggest threats they're likely to be facing?
Well, I think existentially, of course, China is the hardest question for the West as a whole for the remainder of the 21st century. This is not, in my view, an ideological conflict. It's not a Cold War II. although it is a clash of systems. China's an authoritarian country. It seems to be getting more authoritarian. And I think that's in part reflected in its actions, not just domestically, but internationally as well. So thinking through a China strategy, I think, is the top priority. I would put Russia a little bit behind China, but both constitute strategic threats, certainly given the size of Russia's nuclear arsenal and its efforts under Putin to reestablish hegemony in the space of the former Soviet Union, reassert Moscow's influence in the Middle East, in North America, South America, around the world. Those are the two really the strategic issues that face the United States. There are more immediate threats. The threat of international terrorism continues, whether it's directed by Iran or comes from Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and as I think we all need to understand even better now, biological weapons. Looking at Iran and North Korea in particular, those would be the principal sort of immediate threats I think the next president would need to focus on.
John Bolton, many thanks indeed for having a fireside chat.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Now, police officers charged with the death of George Floyd are going to be having their day in court soon, and so it was interesting that the until now secret body cam footage from some of the police was leaked this week to the Daily Mail, and it is being used by some to defend the officers. Now, this footage is from before the period when Derek Chauvin began to kneel on Floyd's neck. It shows the police getting Floyd out of his car, handcuffing him and struggling to get him into their police car before he settles on the ground. The bit I'm about to show you is from the tail end of the 3 or so minutes they were trying to get him to sit in the police car, and he was freaking out. And I must warn viewers, this vision could be distressing.
I'm claustrophobic. I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me. God, I'm claustrophobic, man. Come on over here. I'm going to pull you in. Get in the car. In the front? No, you're not getting in the front. I'm claustrophobic, so I'll get in the car. Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy, man. Get in the car. I'm not a bad guy. Man. Please, officer. Please, please. Take a seat. Please, man. Please. No. Take a seat. I can't choke. I can't breathe, officer. Please. Please. Fine. My wrist, man. My wrist, man, please. I can't take this, man. I can't. I'm only on the ground. I'm only on the ground. I'm only on the ground. I'm in the squad. I'm only on the ground. I'm only on the ground. I'm going down. I'm going down.
Okay, now I just showed you that footage for 3 reasons. 1, because you should get ready for the police to point out that George Floyd was using the phrase, "I can't breathe," all through the process, even before he was restrained. So that's likely to be part of police defence for why they didn't get off him when he kept saying it later on. Secondly, the police have a concept called excited delirium, which is basically people they suspect have been on drugs freaking out as they're getting arrested. The police reckon that people have died from that. Now, there are doctors that dispute this concept's even real, but regardless, during their body cam footage, you can see George Floyd, or hear him, getting very worked up. And also the police, they refer to George Floyd at different parts of the footage, maybe having excited delirium. This is important because restraining suspects on their abdomen until the paramedics arrive is a tactic that the police say can be used to deal with excited delirium. So they may try to use this concept to justify restraining George Floyd. Now, of course, you don't have to be kneeling on someone's neck to restrain them, but the Minneapolis police manual says you can kneel on people's necks in the case of active resistance. So, was George Floyd actively resisting? That is the 3rd reason I showed you that footage. That question will be for the jury to decide. But you can see for yourself how the defence for a second-degree murder charge is shaping up. I've been worried all along, John, that the second-degree murder might have been too heavy a charge to sustain in court, but let's see how this pans out.
Yeah, we certainly will. And you can't help but remember it was not the Rodney King beating video, but the acquittal of the police who beat him that triggered the LA riots.
Yeah.
So this is potentially a very dangerous time. Yeah. But on that note, that is all we have for another Fireside Chat. If you missed this week's Planet America, you'll find it now on iView, Facebook and YouTube, and we will be back on ABC TV next Wednesday at 9:55. And yes, for all those that are asking, we'll be back at the usual time of 9:30 the week after that.
And for all those asking for a pet podcast, no one, we'll have an audio-only edition with Dr. Brendan O'Connor ready for you tonight.
Good night.
Fair.